to believe it was a lone gunman who was a tranny or something. I want to believe that.
That is a lot better of an answer, a lot more comfortable.
100%. I want that. By the way, I'm a middle-aged man. I'm a normie. I don't want to believe anything other than what they tell me.
So we are very much in our ongoing posture of investigation.
So others could have been involved?
Yes, sir.
Anyways, the name that we had received was, it turned out, somebody that actually provided the only eyewitness testimony of having seen the shooter up close.
This wasn't a verbal slip. It wasn't a casual aside or a moment of exaggerated rhetoric. And it certainly wasn't delivered as something light or speculative. When Tucker Carlson leaned forward and suggested that federal authorities had allegedly destroyed evidence connected to Charlie Kirk, the reaction was immediate, but not in the way audiences had come to expect. There was no laughter, no instant outrage, no split-second hot takes. There was silence. Because Carlson didn't frame the claim as a theory, he framed it as something he had been warned not to say aloud. What unsettled viewers most wasn't what Carlson showed, but what he didn't. He presented no documents, he named no agencies, he walked through no timelines or procedural details. Instead, he focused on absence. Evidence that allegedly existed, evidence that was allegedly requested, evidence that was allegedly no longer there. And once he used the word destroyed, the tone shifted completely. That single word reframed everything. Within minutes, clips began circulating. Social media accelerated the moment, stripping it down to its most ominous implication. Headlines sharpened, commentators paused, and one question began trending quietly but persistently beneath the noise. If evidence was destroyed, who wanted it gone? That question marked the moment the story darkened, because Carlson didn't limit his gesture to Charlie Kirk alone. He subtly widened the frame, hinting at something larger, an ecosystem rather than a single individual. Almost immediately, observers began connecting the dots to Turning Point USA, not as a direct accusation but as a looming question mark. Was this about one high-profile figure, or about an organization that suddenly felt uncomfortably close to the blast radius? Supporters were quick to push back. Many argued that Carlson was speaking metaphorically, referring to bureaucratic inefficiency, document retention limits, or routine administrative processes that get sensationalized online. They insisted there was no evidence of wrongdoing and that the language was being deliberately misread. Critics weren't persuaded. They countered that Carlson is precise when he wants to be, and that this wording felt deliberate, not accidental. Then came what many described as the most chilling aspect of all, the silence. No immediate denial, no federal agency stepping forward to say the claim was false, no official clarification, just quiet. And as the hours passed, that quiet grew heavier. In politically charged environments, silence doesn't register as neutral, it registers as weight. People began revisiting past moments with fresh eyes. Missed subpoenas, stalled inquiries, investigations that seemed to vanish mid-cycle, stories that once dominated attention only to fade without resolution. None of these moments proved anything on their own, but once the idea of destroyed evidence was introduced, those fragments felt newly connected, as if part of a larger, unfinished pattern. And that's when the most dangerous question surfaced. If evidence was destroyed once, what else never made it out? Carlson's statement landed with force because it didn't arrive in isolation. It dropped into a climate already shaped by years of distrust, a climate built on half-finished investigations, opaque processes, and a growing belief that some stories don't end because they're resolved, they end because they disappear. That belief didn't emerge out of nowhere. Across the political spectrum, audiences have watched high-profile controversies erupt, dominate headlines, and then quietly dissolve without explanation. Files stall, requests are delayed, questions stop being asked. Eventually, the public moves on not because they're satisfied, but because they're exhausted. That pattern created fertile ground. So when Carlson hinted, carefully and deliberately, that federal authorities had allegedly destroyed evidence connected to Charlie Kirk, the claim didn't land in a vacuum. It landed in a space where many people already believe that absence itself can be a signal. Carlson's role matters here. Whether admired or criticized, he isn't known for throwing out words without intent. His audience believes he chooses language strategically. That's why this moment felt different. He didn't say covered up. He didn't say hid. He said destroyed, a word that implies finality, intent, and irreversibility. That word carries history. For decades, the destruction of evidence, real or alleged, has been the flashpoint in some of the most explosive political scandals. It's the line between negligence and malice, between incompetence and intent. Once that line is publicly suggested, it can't be unsuggested. The tension is amplified by Charlie Kirk's profile. Kirk has long been a polarizing figure, admired by supporters, scrutinized by critics, and constantly surrounded by controversy due to influence alone. That visibility means any hint of federal involvement feels immediately significant, even without specifics, and that's where vagueness becomes powerful. Carlson didn't define the evidence. He didn't outline a case. He described a scenario: something existed, was sought, and was no longer there. Paradoxically, that lack of detail didn't weaken the claim, it strengthened it. Audiences filled in the gaps with their own suspicions, shaped by years of watching stories stall and vanish. The narrative people already carried did the rest. Then there's the organizational layer. When Carlson gestured toward a broader ecosystem, attention shifted toward TPUSA. Not because evidence was presented, but because organizations imply records, emails, communications, paper trails. And paper trails are supposed to survive scrutiny. So when the idea of destruction entered the conversation, it didn't just attach to an individual. It attached to the fear that records themselves might be vulnerable. That's why the reaction escalated so quickly. This wasn't about ideology, it was about process, about how evidence is handled, who controls it, and what it means when the public is implicitly told the process may have failed. Supporters emphasized an important point: destroyed doesn't automatically mean illegally destroyed. Documents can be lawfully disposed of under retention policies and timelines. That distinction matters. But for critics, legality wasn't the core issue. Trust was, and once trust is questioned, explanations arrive late and often sound hollow. That's the space this moment now occupies, not proof, not resolution, but a widening gap filled by silence, suspicion, and a single word that refuses to fade. Long before Tucker Carlson made his now scrutinized comment, a set of unresolved questions had already been circulating beneath the surface of public discourse. Why do so many controversies seem to end not with answers, but with missing records? Why does federal silence so often follow allegations instead of clear explanations? Why does clarification feel rare while absence feels routine? Those questions didn't begin with Carlson. His words simply activated them. Another factor made the moment especially volatile: timing. Carlson's hint arrived after months of unrelated controversies, unresolved inquiries, and prolonged silences involving overlapping circles of people and institutions. To many viewers, his comment didn't feel like a new allegation at all. It felt like confirmation of a pattern they already believed existed. Pattern belief is powerful. Once people believe they are witnessing repetition, coincidence stops feeling plausible. Neutral explanations begin to sound like excuses. Silence transforms from caution into confirmation. Every new event slots seamlessly into a pre-existing narrative framework, and that brings us to the federal angle. Historically, federal agencies rarely respond to vague or indirect claims. Engaging can amplify speculation and legitimize unverified narratives. From an institutional perspective, silence is often strategic. But in an era of eroded trust, strategic silence becomes indistinguishable from avoidance. That is the bind. If agencies respond, they appear to validate the claim. If they don't, audiences assume sensitivity. Either way, the narrative grows. Almost immediately, the public conversation shifted. The initial question, did this actually happen, gave way to something more consequential. Why would the system allow this to happen at all? That shift mattered. The first question demands evidence. The second interrogates structure. Systems are far harder to defend than facts. People began revisiting old headlines: lost emails, missing logs, stalled oversight, delayed responses, not because they were directly related, but because they felt emotionally adjacent. None of those fragments proved anything, but together they formed a web of suspicion that made Carlson's remark feel like a missing puzzle piece. Supporters pushed back forcefully, warning that this was exactly how misinformation metastasizes, by stitching together unrelated grievances into a single sweeping narrative. They argued that Carlson's phrasing was being stripped of its caution and inflated beyond its intent. Critics responded that Carlson understands precisely how his audience interprets language, and that choosing not to clarify is itself a strategic decision. That debate hardened quickly because the issue was no longer about the alleged evidence itself. It was about who controls the story when evidence is gone or believed to be gone. That is why Turning Point USA's name would not disappear from the conversation. Organizations represent permanence, infrastructure, records. If evidence connected to an organization is alleged to be destroyed, people don't assume accident, they assume protection. That assumption may be unfair, but once it takes root, it is almost impossible to dislodge. By the end of this background phase, one thing was clear. This wasn't a single claim being evaluated on its merits. It was a collision between long-standing distrust and one carefully chosen word that reopened every unresolved question people thought they had buried. The stage was set because the next phase was no longer about implication. It was about confrontation. Once Tucker Carlson used the word *destroyed, the conversation hardened instantly. Supporters and critics stopped debating tone and began arguing process, how evidence moves, who controls it, and what happens when it disappears at the moment it is most needed. That shift changed everything. Supporters of Charlie Kirk argued that Carlson's wording was being stretched beyond recognition. They pointed out that destroyed can refer to routine document retention schedules, automated deletions, or materials deemed irrelevant under standard protocols. In their view, critics were transforming bureaucratic procedure into conspiracy theater. Critics weren't satisfied with procedural explanations. They focused on sequence. According to online interpretations, Carlson's phrasing suggested a chain of events. Evidence existed, it was sought, and it was no longer available. That sequence implies interaction, not accident. And once interaction is implied, questions follow. Who handled it? Who categorized it? Who decided its fate? That's when the conflict ignited in earnest. Commentary ecosystems split sharply. One side framed the moment as reckless insinuation, dangerous because it undermines trust without proof. The other framed it as whistle-adjacent language, deliberately cautious to avoid exposing sources while signaling a deeper problem. Both sides claimed responsibility. Both accused the other of manipulation. Neither could conclusively prove anything. The conflict escalated as critics began pairing Carlson's comment with unrelated but emotionally adjacent examples of evidence mishandling from past controversies. Emails lost, logs overwritten, records deemed non-responsive. None were directly connected. But together they formed a narrative of fragility, the idea that evidence in high-stakes situations may be more vulnerable than the public wants to believe. Supporters called this tactic unfair, guilt by atmosphere rather than fact. They argued that stitching together unrelated failures creates a myth of inevitability. If evidence disappears somewhere, it must disappear everywhere. But the internet does not operate on courtroom standards, it operates on credibility gradients. Then came the first twist. Commentators familiar with federal processes began offering subtle clarifications. Destroyed, they explained, does not always mean illegally destroyed. Documents can be disposed of under lawful authority, sometimes before a request is formalized, sometimes because a category wasn't flagged in time. That explanation should have de-escalated the story. Instead, it escalated it. If evidence can be lawfully destroyed before it is requested, critics argued, then the system itself creates windows where truth can evaporate without accountability. The issue was no longer malice, it was architecture. That reframing was devastating. The argument stopped being about whether anyone did something wrong and became about whether the system allows outcomes that look *wrong. Systems don't have faces, they can't apologize, they can't reassure, so blame spreads outward, touching everyone within the orbit. That is when Turning Point USA entered the conflict more forcefully, not through accusation but through association. Critics asked whether organizational scale increases exposure to such vulnerabilities. More records, more communications, more institutional interfaces, more places where things can quietly disappear. Supporters warned that organizational implication without evidence is reputational arson. They argued that no group should be dragged into suspicion based on a vague comment from a talk show, but the battlefield had already shifted. The debate was no longer did this happen? It was could this happen, and has it before? That question is far harder to extinguish. The conflict intensified when Carlson declined to clarify further. No follow-up, no narrowing of scope, no retraction. To supporters, that restraint suggested he didn't want to inflate a misinterpretation. To critics, it suggested he had already said as much as he safely could. Once again, silence became accelerant. Creators dissected the pause frame by frame. Why hint without detail? Why stop there? Why not say more or say less? Every choice was interpreted as strategy. Then the first twist sharpened further. A former investigator, speaking generally, explained how evidence handling often hinges on timing and categorization. If a request isn't precise, if a category isn't preserved, materials can be disposed of without anyone acting improperly. The takeaway was chilling. Truth can be lost without anyone breaking the rules. That explanation landed like a gut punch because it validated the fear without validating the accusation. Critics seized on it as confirmation that Carlson's hint wasn't about villains, it was about vulnerability. Supporters countered that this was exactly why insinuations are dangerous. They weaponize systemic complexity into suspicion. The conflict spilled into broader discourse about trust. If systems can erase answers inadvertently, how can the public ever be confident in outcomes? And if confidence erodes, what replaces it? Speculation. That was the apex of the first major twist. People stopped asking whether evidence was destroyed. They started asking whether any remaining evidence could be trusted, and once that doubt sets in, every official explanation feels incomplete. Every closure feels premature. Supporters warned this was a slippery slope toward nihilism, where no institution can be believed and every absence is treated as conspiracy. Critics responded that blind trust is a luxury afforded only to those who have never watched accountability fail. The standoff hardened. One side demanded restraint and responsibility. The other demanded transparency and reform. Neither side got what it wanted. By the end of this phase, the most dangerous allegation wasn't that evidence had been destroyed. It was that the system might allow truth to disappear without anyone being accountable. And once that idea takes hold, the story stops being about Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson, or Turning Point USA. It becomes existential. After Carlson's comments circulated, the discourse mutated again. People stopped dissecting phrasing and began reconstructing institutional behavior. Threads appeared mapping evidence preservation protocols, retention policies, and accountability gaps. The tone shifted from outrage to alarm. Alarm is more dangerous than outrage. Outrage burns hot and fades, alarm embeds. Social media filled with diagrams, timelines, and pseudo-explainers. None proved anything. But together they created the sense that the public was staring into a black box, one where evidence could vanish without villain, without trace, without consequence. Then came the next shocking realization. The story wasn't about Charlie Kirk anymore. It was about process failure. Commentators began pointing out that if evidence can be destroyed lawfully before a request is finalized, then timing itself becomes power. Whoever controls timing controls preservation, and whoever controls preservation controls what history is allowed to examine. That idea spread rapidly. Supporters pushed back, arguing this was a gross misreading of bureaucratic reality. Retention schedules exist to prevent data hoarding, protect privacy, and maintain efficiency, not to erase truth. Critics responded that intent no longer mattered. Impact did. If the outcome is missing evidence, trust erodes regardless of motive. The escalation intensified when observers noticed something subtle but critical. No one was defining scope. Not Carlson, not federal agencies, not adjacent institutions. Silence wasn't just absence, it was non-definition, and non-definition allows narratives to expand unchecked. That vacuum pulled Turning Point USA deeper into the conversation, not through allegation, but through proximity. Critics argued that organizations with scale and influence naturally generate records that matter. If individual-level evidence is allegedly destroyed, organizational materials become the next logical concern. Supporters warned that this logic has no limiting principle. Any group becomes fair game for suspicion without proof. Both sides had a point. That's why the story escalated instead of collapsing. The next reveal came when legal analysts, again speaking broadly, acknowledged that evidence preservation is not uniform across agencies. Different rules, different triggers, different timelines. That inconsistency means outcomes can vary dramatically even in similar situations. The implication was chilling, not because it confirmed wrongdoing, but because it suggested truth is unevenly protected. If evidence is preserved in one case but not another due to technicalities, the public cannot distinguish between failure and foul play. The result is the same: unanswered questions. That realization sent shock waves through the discourse. People began asking whether the system is designed to produce clarity or merely finality. If records can be destroyed before scrutiny, then scrutiny becomes optional rather than foundational. Supporters warned this line of thinking erodes trust in every institution. Critics responded that trust built on opacity isn't trust, it's obedience. The escalation peaked when Carlson still did not elaborate. No second hint, no narrowing, no clarification. His restraint became a Rorschach test. Supporters saw caution, critics saw constraint. Then came perhaps the most unsettling turn. A former federal records specialist explained that once evidence is destroyed under policy, there is no mechanism to reconstruct what it was. No summary, no audit trail of meaning, no accountability beyond procedural compliance. That revelation landed hard. If something important vanishes, the public may never even know what questions to ask. At that moment, the story crossed into something darker. This was no longer about who destroyed what, it was about whether truth can be permanently unknowable by design. That idea terrifies people. Terrified audiences do not disengage, they dig, they speculate, they connect dots that may not belong together. The discourse spilled into broader cultural anxiety about transparency, oversight, and power. Supporters accused critics of collapsing nuance into paranoia. Critics accused supporters of defending systems that benefit from silence. The middle ground evaporated. By the end of this phase, the transformation was complete. What began as a single remark had become a referendum on whether absence of evidence can ever be meaningfully distinguished from evidence of absence. That question cannot be answered with a press release. It requires trust, and trust, once fractured, does not heal quickly. The story did not resolve, it embedded. Which brings us to the next phase, where reactions become strategic, silence becomes positioning, and the absence of clarity speaks louder than any allegation ever could. By this stage, the public reaction had evolved into something colder and far more durable. There were no trending hashtags, no daily outrage cycles, no viral slogans demanding answers. What replaced them was quieter and more permanent suspicion, a lingering sense that something fundamental had gone unaddressed. And that lingering doubt became the industry's greatest concern. Because once audiences stop believing clarity is coming, they stop listening to explanations altogether. Every silence becomes confirmation, every statement feels like deflection, every boundary looks strategic. That is the environment this story now inhabits. By the end of this phase, one reality was undeniable. This controversy had crossed the point where a single clarification could resolve it. Even if evidence surfaced tomorrow proving everything benign, the reaction to its absence would still matter. Trust does not reset simply because information arrives late. And that realization set the stage for the final phase, where one last twist reframes why this story may never fully resolve, and why the most powerful force driving it forward is not proof or accusation, but permanent doubt. The final twist did not arrive with leaked documents, a whistleblower, or a courtroom filing. It arrived quietly in the form of a realization that refused to leave. This story no longer requires proof to continue. Once the idea took hold that evidence could be destroyed without anyone ever seeing it, the center of gravity shifted. The question stopped being what happened and became what can ever be proven now. That question is far more dangerous. Proof ends debates, doubt multiplies them. In the days following the allegations spread, observers noticed a subtle but critical change in language. People stopped asking for receipts. They stopped demanding confirmation. Instead, they began talking about systems, about process, about how power operates when no one is watching. That was the moment the story stopped being about individuals and became about structures. When Tucker Carlson first hinted that evidence connected to Charlie Kirk had allegedly been destroyed, many expected a follow-up, a clarification, a narrowing of scope, something that would either escalate the claim or diffuse it. Nothing came. That silence did something extraordinary. It allowed every interpretation to coexist. Supporters argued Carlson chose restraint to avoid inflaming speculation. Critics argued he had already said as much as he safely could. Both interpretations survived because neither could be disproven. And once a narrative reaches that state, where silence can be read as wisdom or warning, it becomes immune to correction. That is the most unsettling turn of all. Even if nothing improper occurred, the belief that it could have occurred is now embedded. That belief no longer needs reinforcement. It resurfaces whenever institutions decline to explain, whenever records are unavailable, whenever a case ends without answers. It becomes a reflex, not a conclusion. Then there is the organizational shadow. The moment Turning Point USA entered the conversation, even indirectly, the stakes multiplied. Organizations represent continuity, archives, communications, institutional memory. When the public begins to suspect that records tied to organizations can disappear, the issue stops being partisan. It becomes existential. People stop asking who did this and start asking how often does this happen? And that question has no satisfying answer. The final twist is this: clarity may no longer be possible without creating new damage. Any attempt to explain risks amplifying a claim that may be unfounded. Any refusal to explain reinforces the perception that something is too sensitive to discuss. The window for a clean resolution has closed. What remains is posture, and posture is what audiences remember. From this point forward, every silence will feel deliberate to someone. Every boundary will feel strategic to someone else. Every future controversy, even unrelated, will be filtered through this moment. Not because guilt was proven, but because doubt was normalized. And normalized doubt is the most corrosive outcome of all. This story does not end with a verdict. It ends with a condition. A condition in which the public must decide whether trust can survive systems that do not or cannot show their work. Until that question is answered, this controversy is not resolved. It is dormant. Dormant stories do not disappear, they wait. They resurface when context changes, when new allegations arise, when silence happens again and people remember the last time silence seemed to mean everything. That is the cliffhanger, not what was destroyed, but whether anything like this can ever be reconstructed in a world where absence has become the loudest signal of all. If you are still paying attention, you already understand why this is not just another headline. This is about trust, about transparency, about what happens when the public is told, explicitly or implicitly, that answers may be gone forever. Now we want to hear from you, not rehearsed reactions, not safe answers. Do you believe hints like this are responsible warnings or reckless insinuations without proof? When institutions remain silent, does that protect integrity or undermine it? If evidence can be destroyed lawfully, should the system change? Or should the public accept that some truths will never be known? This debate is not going away. It is only getting quieter and therefore more dangerous. If you want to stay ahead of what comes next, engage with the full discussion, not just the clipped moments. Subscribe so you're present when silence breaks or deepens. Turn on notifications because developments in stories like this rarely arrive with warning. And when you share your perspective, choose your words carefully. In stories like this, the most powerful thing is not what gets said, it's what never gets answered.